Okay, the microphone is on. Give me an inch. I think I'm a ruler. So here's what we're going to do. No one has introduced me, so I don't really exist. But while I don't exist, I am able to answer questions from J.A.Jance's point of view. So if you want to ask questions while people are up until the official introduction, that will be fine. But you need to understand that I am deaf. And so if you ask me a question that I do not hear, the answer will tend to be very bizarre. So if you want to ask a question, you have to commit to speaking up until I can hear you. So, given that, she has the first question.
I go to your website frequently and look at what's happening with your career and your writing. And it amazes me to see the schedule of speaking engagements over the next few months. And I'm wondering how you're able to do writing while you're putting on all these presentations.
She wants to know how she's looked at my website, seen my calendar, which caused my husband to have a heart attack, by the way. When he saw the part about me being in Spokane tonight and in Everett at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do you want to know a secret? I'm using a private jet to get there. For a girl who came dragging her very poor butt into Seattle in 1981, I was driving my '78 Cutlass Supreme Brougham that my first husband said I never should have bought and would never be able to pay for. I had my two little kids in the back seat, and I had my all of our worldly possessions in a U-Haul trailer behind us. And I only cried when the kids were asleep because I didn't want them to know how frightened I was, because I didn't know if I would be able to support us or not. It's pretty neat to be going back to Seattle in a private jet. And I'm sure my first husband, the rat, is rolling over in his grave. Next question. Actually, you asked two questions. You wanted to know how I write and keep this schedule. Well, we were on vacation for 2 weeks, and for 4 days of that 2 weeks, I was finishing a manuscript, the next Allie Reynolds book. And Bill and Lauren, by the way, I received an email yesterday from my editor at Simon & Schuster saying the book is perfect, they loved it, and they are sending a check without my having to do an editorial letter. So. But the truth is, I work hard, and that included working on vacation. So, okay. Now, there was a question over here. There you are. Somebody told you that I was getting rid of J.P. Beaumont? Who was it, Earl Emerson? No, the next, well, you know, my husband had his dual knee replacement 6 years ago. I used that. He's not dead, and neither is J.P. Beaumont, so don't worry about him. In fact, the next book I'm writing should be the next Beaumont. Not to worry. Okay, for those of you who are late arrivals, this is an informal Q&A, and your only obligation is to make sure I can hear the questions. So are there any other questions?
When can we hear from Mary Higgins Clark? Oh, I'm sorry.
You just want to piss me off?
Ma'am, I love your books, and on your covers, you have those fabulous-looking dogs. Are they still with you?
Okay, let me give you a brief history of dogs in our family. When my second husband and I married in 1985, and we were blending our two families, we figured some puppies would give everybody a little common ground. So we went out right after we came home from our honeymoon and returned with 2 golden retrievers who, because my husband was an electronics engineer, were named Nikki and Tess after Nikola Tesla. We had those dogs for 12 and 13 years, respectively, at which point they crossed the Rainbow Bridge. In the meantime, our son had come home with a puppy from the Pullman Pound. And when he brought the puppy home, and I offered to housebreak it between Thanksgiving and Christmas, the puppy was so little that I could carry him in one hand as I was taking him up and down the stairs to housebreak him. And when I could carry that little puppy in one hand, I had no inkling that he was actually, as the vet told me about 9 months later, I said, "What kind of a dog is this?" He said, "Well, it's a black and tan Canardley." I said, "What kind of a dog is that?" He said, "Well, you can hardly tell what kind of a dog it is." But I think he's half German Shepherd and half Irish Wolfhound. And he eventually grew to where he could put his chin flat on any given table. And so he was a total gentleman. And he came into our lives when Nikki and Tess were already there. And when we lost both of those dogs, Boney, whom, by the way, you met if you read my first Walker book, Hour of the Hunter. Oho is Johanna Adam for bone. He was in mourning. And so we came home with 2 little red dog golden retriever puppies. And, you know, the engineer had had his time in the sun. So these 2 sister dogs were named Aggie and Daphne after Agatha Christie and Daphne du Maurier. They were so cute. And the only way we could tell them apart was to have colored ribbons around their necks. But we brought these little puppies in, and Boney took a look at Daphne and said, "You're fine." And then he took a look at Aggie and said, "You are the devil's spawn." And for as long as Boney was alive, if Aggie came anywhere near him, he bared his teeth at her. And so that caused, once we lost Boney, then Nikki and Tess had to sort out who was the real boss of the family, because Boney had lifted Daphne's place in the pack, and Aggie thought she should be top dog. So then we had Aggie and Daphne. We spent half of our year in Arizona, and we came home for Christmas. Aggie came down with pneumonia, and nothing the vet could do fixed her, and eventually we lost her. So after Christmas, when we went back to Arizona, Daphne came down with the same symptoms. And I thought, we're going to lose her too. But we took her to a vet in Tucson, and the vet said, this dog has pneumonia, but the pneumonia is due to a fungal disorder that doesn't present as ordinary valley fever. Valley fever is a spore-carried ailment that dogs and people develop in the Southwest. And so he said, she's very ill. There's a 50-50 chance that we can save her. We will treat her aggressively. Now, in the world of veterinarian speak, treating a dog aggressively really means treating a dog expensively. And so for the next 2.5 months, she went through one increasingly more expensive treatment after another. Itraconazole, which is the drug they use to treat valley fever, they tried giving her the generic, but it turns out the generic drug doesn't work on dogs. You have to have the real drug. And so they called in a prescription to Costco. And I went to Costco and I said, do you have my prescription ready? They said, do you know it costs $500? And I said, well, is it ready? And they said, well, do you still want it? I said, it's for my dog. Of course I want it. So by the middle of March, Daphne had sort of stabilized and seemed to be getting better. And so on a Thursday afternoon, I was sitting out on the patio with Tinas, our property manager, and Daphne and I enjoying the shade. In Tucson, you actually enjoy shade in March. And Bill came out. In our family, I write the books, my husband writes the checks. So he came out, and he looked a little gray. And I said, Bill, what's the matter? He said, I've just added up all the money we've spent on Daphne in the last 2.5 months. $15,000. And he pointed at Daphne and he said, you are truly a golden retriever. So Tinas reached over and he put his arm around Daphne's shoulder and he said, Daphne, you must catch a burglar to earn your plate of food. That was Thursday. On Friday, I finished writing a book. And the world has changed. I no longer have to print a 400-page manuscript to send it. All I have to do is put it into an email. So I shipped it off to New York, and Bill took me out to dinner to celebrate. The restaurant was 3 blocks away. We had cocktails, we had wine. We came home, and we were in bed by 9 o'clock. And at 10 o'clock, this dog, who had not barked for 2.5 months because she was too sick, awakened us barking fiercely. And I sat up in bed in time to see Tinas go out through our sliding door with Daphne right on his heels. And I thought, boy, why would Tinas come into our bedroom without knocking? So they went out into the backyard. And our yard in Tucson has an exterior wall and then an interior wall. And Tinas was standing over across the yard, but inside the interior wall. And Daphne was still barking. So I went out, and Bill came out after me, and I said, Tinas, what is it? In Tucson, the wildlife, the coyotes and the bobcats, use the washes that run through town as sort of animal freeways. And there had been javelina in the neighborhood. So I said, what do you see out there? Well, Bill came out. He was wearing his underwear, and he said, okay, Tina's is out here. Daphne is out here. If there's a bobcat in the backyard, I'm not going to deal with it in my shorts. I'm going back inside. So I kept saying, Tina's, what do you see out there? And gradually, he came walking over to me. And when he was about as far away from me as the fan, I realized it wasn't Tina's. And I said, who the hell are you and what are you doing in my bedroom? Which brought Bill right back out, still in his shorts. And he said, I'm Gary. I'm looking for some smokes. In the previous several weeks, there had been any number of break-ins in our neighborhood, enough that they actually started a neighborhood watch program. And these break-ins occurred when people were at home, and the only thing that was taken were cigarettes. So I went in and woke up Tina's. He was still asleep. He wasn't in the backyard. And Bill and Tina's collected this guy, led him out to the front yard while I called the cops. The cops came. We turned him over to him. And Bill and Tina's, still in their shorts, went into the house. But I had the presence of mind to put on a robe. So I went out and sort of hung on the block wall and eavesdropped. And pretty soon I heard them mention a street, and that this guy had gone AWOL from a halfway house on this particular street. And so the next morning, when we woke up, having had very little sleep, we looked up halfway houses on that street, and we found one. So at noon that day, we went there. And with Bill driving the getaway car, I got up, walked up to the door, knocked on the door. An attendant answered. I said, hi, is Gary here? She said, who are you? I said, I'm the woman whose bedroom he was in at 10 o'clock last night. She said, really? Where do you live? I told her. She said, we lived about 4 miles from there. And believe me, Gary was not in any condition to be. He was drugged out of his gourd. He wasn't violent, but he was medicated. She said, well, you know, usually when he gets out, we find him right here in the neighborhood. Isn't that reassuring? I did manage to find out that he had been incarcerated for some incident in California, and his relatives had prevailed upon him to be transferred to a halfway house in Tucson. We were not able to find out what he had done in California because guess what? He had HIPAA protection. The facility where he was staying started out in the 50s. It's run by a purportedly nonprofit, and they started out doing respite care for families with people who had cerebral palsy or some kind of ailment where the families needed to have someone to help out. But then they found out that they could make a lot more money running halfway houses for drug addicts and any number of other undesirable folks. So I took exception to that. I got on the phone, and gradually I made my way up through the chain of command until I landed on the CEO's telephone. And I said, you know, you need to take better care of your people because one of them is going to turn up dead. He said, you wouldn't want to shoot somebody. I said, he was in my bedroom. This is Arizona. Now, in case this is sounding very familiar to you, I was writing a book, so of course I put it right in the next book. You can't afford to just turn up your nose at something that good. And Daphne recovered from her treatment, and we had her for another 5 years. 4 years into that, on an October day, I was coming home from a shopping trip with my daughter and grandson, and we found a little miniature dachshund running desperately up the road in the opposite lane, chasing after the car that had just dumped her, which is how Bella, our miniature dachshund, came into our lives. So we've lost both Aggie and Daphne now. So now we have transitioned from an 80-pound golden retriever down to a 10-pound dog. But I think at our age, a 10-pound dog suits us, which was probably the longest answer in history to a very simple question. If you don't want to know, don't ask. Okay, anybody else have nerve enough to ask a question? I'm okay. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is Carol going to make her presence known through you tonight in House Carol's album?
This is a smart woman. And the answer to your question is yes. Yes. And I want to see, in addition to her, how many people in this room read my blog? If not, why not? Well, let's ask a related question. How many people in this room receive announcements from me before new books come out? Oh my God, do I have a lot of work to do. All right, here is the deal. I have a website. It is very difficult to remember. It is J.A.Jance.com. If you go to my website, there are some useful things. For those of you who are maybe new readers and who only read series books in order, on the lower right-hand corner of the website welcome page, there's a thing that says books listed in order. And up at the top, there's a thing that says blog. I write a blog. It's posted every Friday. It is free. It tells you, it's sort of like reading my autobiography in weekly installments. And because she mentioned Carol, I know she read last week's blog. But I'm sorry, it's going to be a rerun for you, but all of these other people have no idea. There's also a place on the website that says, contact me. And if you click on it, you'll be signing up for the new book announcement newsletter. You put in your name, your city and state, and those come to me. They do not come to anybody else. I don't have a group of trolls living under the bridge in my backyard who sort my emails and only give me the important ones. Because, ladies and gentlemen, every email from one of my readers is important. I read them all. I answer them all. Nobody else touches that mailing list. Nobody else responds to my emails. There was a woman, she's a woman now. We were girls together in Bisbee, Arizona. You will find in the course of this talk that I do hold grudges. And my grudge with her is that she lived on the Vista, which you'll read about in Remains of Innocence. I did not. And when we were second graders, I was not invited to her birthday party. And turns out I'm still pissed about it, so. So she wrote me an email a few years ago, and she said, well, whoever is reading this, please get this to J.A.Jance because we were in school together in Bisbee, Arizona. I will not tell you what name she signed at the bottom because then you'd know who she is. But I wrote back and I said, who do you think is reading my emails? Whoa, but trust me, I do not sell my list. And yesterday, 2 people got offers from me to lower their mortgage rates. No, I send emails that have content in them. If you get an email from me that has nothing but, or from anybody else for that matter, if there's just a link on it, trust me, do not click on it, discard that letter. And in addition, if you get an emergency email from somebody claiming to be me, telling you that I was traveling in Turkey and somebody has stolen my money, would you do not respond to that by sending money. People must do it, but geez, don't be that dumb. Okay, so that's a very long answer to your question. How are we doing for time? Okay, I'll take one more question, and I will, by the time she's up here to introduce me, I'll be done answering it. Any other questions? Yes. Why Seattle? You'll be hearing more about that in the course of the talk. I was coming from Phoenix. I was a refugee from a bad marriage and a worse divorce. And I figured putting 1,700 miles between me and my former husband was about the right number of miles. And I had a sister and 2 nephews living in Seattle. So I came up and moved into the Denny Regrade with my sister. And my kids, my son and daughter, were sort of pioneer kids in the Denny Regrade because there weren't a lot of kids in the Denny Regrade. But I think it went through a period when it was a little more kid-friendly. And now I think it's a lot more drug user friendly. So probably not as kid friendly. But that's why Seattle. But I'll be talking about that a little tonight. Okay. I think someone is coming down right now. She might be going to introduce me.
Are you okay there while I do this?
We're good.
Good? Okay. Well, good evening. It's lovely to see you all tonight, and thanks for coming downtown to support not only one of our very favorite authors, but your local independent bookstore, and one of our community's favorite treasures, this theater. all the money that's taken in tonight helps to pay for the use of the venue, and I know I come here very often, so thank you for helping support that. I would also like to take a moment to thank a few people. Carolyn Lambertson at the Spokesman Review wrote a wonderful article about J.A.Jance, which I think a lot of you have probably found out about this event that way, and it was just an honor for her to do that. Also, Jerry Decker, Michael Smith, and Friends of the Bing, who are volunteering tonight at the door. All of this would not happen without them, so thank you very much. Future events at Auntie's Bookstore, I always like to kind of let you know while you're at one so that you come to others. So while this is not at the bookstore, it is sponsored by Auntie's. And we do have a couple other events that I just wanted to let you know about. August 7th, I was going to bring a little copy of it and I forgot it, but there's a little book going around town and selling like wildfire called Spokane Shorties. And I don't know if any of you have seen it. It was actually a fundraiser project that Get Lit did this year. And in it are very short stories written by many, many, many fabulous Spokane writers. Some you may know and some may be new to you. They did have to submit to get into the book. And we are going to host a showcase for that book. So I have at least 13 of the writers in the book who will be reading short snippets of their writing. The Sante restaurant next door will be having a beverage service starting at 6:30 that night. So you could come and have a drink and meet the authors, and we will have a very long table for people to sign books. I think the book is only $10, and it makes a great gift to give people out of town to get to know our town. So that event is on August 7th at 7 o'clock, and we hope that you can be there. And the last event I wanted to mention is we do an Auntie's Debut Authors Series, which is a new series that it is our hope that it helps to bring these new amazing authors that you might miss their first book out and get them that notice and get you hooked up with them. So when the second book comes out and they're too busy to come back to Spokane, like you were there and when they were a no one. and so our next one is Malcolm Brooks, whose book Painted Horses has gotten Library Journal starred reviews, Publishers Weekly starred reviews. David James Duncan has done a wonderful review for it. Rick Bass, Jim Harrison, all these amazing authors are just loving this book. So Malcolm Brooks will be at the bookstore on August 19th at 7 o'clock. So put on your calendar and come meet a brand new author. So I think that's it for all of my commercial talk, and I will get to the introduction that we have tonight. So tonight, we are here to honor the top 10 New York Times bestselling author, J.A.Jance. This event...
Thank you.
This event is the national launch for her newest addition to the Joanna Brady series, Remains of Innocence, and we are thrilled that she chose to spend it with us. Judy first knew she wanted to be a writer when she was in second grade and read The Wizard of Oz. However, life does happen, and long before she was published, she taught high school English, was a school librarian, and spent time selling insurance. She was first published in 1985 when Until Proven Guilty, a Beaumont book, was released. She now has 22 books in the Beaumont series alone, as well as 17 books in the Joanna Brady series, 9 Allie Reynolds books, 4 interrelated thrillers about the Walker family, and a beautiful book of poetry. She's a very busy and accomplished lady, to say the least. J.A.Jance, as you know from the stories she's already told, has poured her life stories into her work. It's all in there, the heartbreak, the chaos, and the hardships, along with secrets, happinesses, and fortitude. She has lived it all, and lucky for us, she chooses to share it through her stories and her poetry. She says she has the best job in the world. I think I can safely say that we are all very glad she enjoys it. Please welcome J.A.Jance.
The thing about going on a book tour is to be in a room of people who read my books. And I feel as though my readers are my friends. And being out on tour gives me an opportunity to hear how my books impact their lives. And that's one of the things I refer to as the psychological income of being a writer. There's a bit of monetary income to being a writer, too. And because of it, we've just spent the last book, as my husband pointed out, on a bit of folly. On Sunday night of this week, 2 days before the book tour started, we came home from a 2-week, I'm not going to say vacation, a 2-week Rick Steves family vacation. I did say the word, but with our kids and grandkids and several hangers-on who are not entirely related. And so this was far more a crusade than it was restful, particularly since I had to finish the book before I could do any sightseeing. So we started in Rome and ended in Paris with stops in Venice and Tuscany and Austria and Switzerland and Germany, and ended in Paris. We were in Venice. Bills of my room was on the first floor, and of course, in Europe, the first floor is one set of stairs up. Now, I've always had a propensity to fall. So our dinner that evening was at the little restaurant right next door, and as we were eating dessert, I think you guys have already figured out I am a woman of a certain age. And so we were eating dessert, and suddenly I'm hearing in my ear, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, which is Beethoven's fifth way of my hearing aid telling me the battery is dying. Well, we were going for the full meal deal, Venice experience. We had booked 4 gondolas for an evening cruise. We had hired an accordion player and an opera singer. And so I did not want to miss out on this fun because I didn't have my hearing aid in. So I excused myself. I went back to the hotel. I went up the stairs. I traded both batteries, came back down, clinging to the handrail, and made absolutely certain that I put my foot down on the landing when I came to the bottom of the stairway. Then I turned to my right, went through the lobby, and went flying off an invisible step. I went down, I landed right about here against the marble counter of the check-in desk. So I pushed myself off from that, leaving a ring of bruises that went from here around my shoulders. And then I toppled over and landed on my back on the floor of the lobby. Fortunately, I was wearing my hair in a scrunchie, so my brains did not get scrambled. We were in Italy. The desk clerk, who was tiny, by the way, wearing this wonderful, impeccably tailored suit, leaped to his feet and came to help Madame up. But you know, there's a physics problem here. they use cranes that are tall to raise things. And he was not tall enough to raise me. And so he started to try to pull me up, and I said, no, bring me that chair. So he brought a chair over, and with his help, I managed to scramble up on the chair and get myself back upright. And then I could feel that nothing was broken. The only thing that was damaged was my ego. So I shook myself off, and we went walking to where the gondolas are kept. Do you know, gondolas are very tippy. So the guy was, the guy who rows it, went to help me in. And he grabbed me, and he flung me into the boat like he was landing a halibut. The only thing that kept me from somersaulting right over the edge into the canal was I found this little metal handle on a stool, and I grabbed a hold of it for dear life. And then the comfortable seats were in the back, but I was not going to try walking in that thing. So I sat on the stool where I was. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. So I thought. So now, here we are on the Grand Canal. It's Venice. There's a supermoon rising with just a little curtain of clouds in front of it. I knew I should have been thinking romantic thoughts, but when you're on a gondola with all your kids and grandkids, it's sort of... And so instead, I leaned back against my husband's knees and was just lying there, looking up at the sky and thinking about Carol Burnett. You know, I loved Carol Burnett from the time she walked out on stage on the Ed Sullivan Show and belted out, "I made a fool of myself over John Foster Dulles." And I always admired her because she was tall, she was sort of awkward looking, and she would do these amazing pratfalls and always come up grinning. And so we were there floating along, and I was thinking about how I was going to write my blog about Carol Burnett and me. And then a speedboat came by, and a huge wave washed over the side of the gondola, soaking me from head to toe and leaving me with a mouthful of seawater. I am afraid I did not come up smiling. But I did something wonderful. I have given my kids and grandkids a family legend that they'll be able to talk about for the rest of their lives. And what could be better than that? So we got home Sunday night, and the book tour started Tuesday. I did 3 events on Tuesday. This is Wednesday. I did an event this morning, and here I am this evening. My son took me to the Davenport. I went upstairs, I checked in, and while I was gone, he bought me some of the Davenport's wonderful peanut brittle, which sort of revived me enough. And I trust I won't flop over and go to sleep in the course of this talk. So, you're probably starting to wonder, is she ever going to talk about her books? Well, maybe. if I feel like it. She alluded to my story. I wanted to be a writer from a very early age. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona. Because I wanted to be a writer, I signed up to be an English major. And then in 1964, when I was a junior, and it was time for upper division courses, I tried to sign up for the creative writing class. And the professor said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses. Boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me into his class. So I married a guy who was allowed in the creative writing class that was closed to me. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He never had anything published. He died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. But that didn't keep him from telling me 6 months after we got married, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." Well, he was right. There was only one writer in our family. But I'd like to give you a few pieces of wisdom to take away from this event tonight. And one of those is this: if you have friends or relations who are budding mystery writers, it's a good idea not to make them mad. Because we have our ways of getting even. In my first hardback book, my first non-Beaumont book, Hour of the Hunter, the main character is a woman who's a teacher on an Indian reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. She too has a husband who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. Her husband is dead at the beginning of the book. And as for the crazed killer, he turns out to be a former professor of creative writing. From the University of Arizona. And every time one of my books makes it to the top 10 on the New York Times bestsellers list, I bet that guy is just spinning in his grave. I sold life insurance for 10 years. The last 5 were in Phoenix. And you know, those were tough years. I had little kids. I had a husband who was a drunk. Every Friday, the guys in the agency, the other district managers and some of their agents, would go out for a beer. They never invited me to go along. I couldn't have because I had to get home to the babysitter. But it would have been nice to be invited, but I wasn't. I finally divorced my husband when he turned up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in Phoenix, so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. And after 18 years, it was during that walk with my kids' friends, and their parents, with my husband crawling on his hands and knees, when I finally realized that If 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I had to do something to save myself and save my kids. That's when I got a divorce. And as soon as I got a divorce, he started saying he would show up every Saturday morning at the house and he'd say, well, you know, you said in sickness and in health. But excuse me, he had already been hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. So that was when I made the decision that I had to get out of town, because I didn't divorce him because I didn't love him any longer. I divorced him because I had to do it to save myself. So I came to Seattle, the kids and me in a U-Haul trailer. If you give the person whom you love a choice between your booze and they choose booze, it sort of breaks your heart. And so when I got to Seattle, I tried to figure out how to make my life better. And I heard about the Dale Carnegie course and thought that would turn me into a better life insurance salesman. I took the course, and in Dale Carnegie, you give a series of talks. And one of the talks I gave was you were supposed to talk about something that happened to you that changed the course of your life. And so I talked about how an encounter my first husband and I had with a serial killer in Tucson in 1970 changed me. And when that talk was over, somebody came up to me and said, somebody needs to write a book about that. And I thought, well, I'm divorced. What have I got to lose? She said that to me on Thursday night. On Sunday afternoon, I started writing my first book. It was never published. It will never be published. For one thing, it was 1,200 pages long, which is 3 times too long to be an ordinary murder mystery. But that book was where I started. Then, on Thanksgiving night of 1982, my husband had sobered up after months of steady drinking. He sobered up because his mother was coming to town for Thanksgiving. And as a consequence, after Thanksgiving dinner that night, he went into DT's. He was hospitalized with no liver or kidney function, and he died a few minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve. When someone dies, you have to go get out all of these official pieces of paper. And during the time I was married to him, once he was passed out cold in his recliner, I spent my time writing these little snippets of poetry. And because I thought I was being true to my art, but I knew I wasn't being true to him. And because I wasn't supposed to be a writer, I hid those pieces of poetry away in the strongbox. So when I got out the official pieces of paper I knew I needed, there were all those other pieces of paper. And in reading them, it was like seeing my life in instant replay. I showed them to somebody else, and they said, those poems should be a book. And now they are a book. Is there somebody from Auntie's here tonight? Do you have After the Fire, I Trust? You do, okay. After the Fire came out first. It was my first book. It was a little brown pamphlet. It was really ugly. Now it is a lovely hardback. And they've allowed me to put in little essays that tell you where I was and what was happening in my life when I wrote each of those poems. So if you read After the Fire, what you're going to do is, it's poetry, but it's also my autobiography. It will tell you a lot about who I am. But as you read it, if you're familiar with my characters, you'll see the origins of many of my characters lurking in those poems. You will see my mother. My mother, Evelyn, and I went to war for many years. We were at war when I was in my 20s and didn't have any kids. And you know, what happened is the older I got, the smarter my mother got. And so you'll see that evolution in the poetry. So I'd like to recite for you the title poem of that book, After the Fire. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. When I'm sitting at a book signing table, you sort of have to hand sell poetry. And I will say to someone, would you like After the Fire? And they'll sort of leap back from me, kind of like they were about to be attacked by a striking rattlesnake. And I understand those people. They are someone who had a terminal fear of public speaking. And as high school sophomores, were forced to stand up in class and recite the Ode to a Grecian Urn. As a consequence, they suffer from a case of poetry-induced post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I try to let people know that this is not the Ode to a Grecian Urn. This is a lot more understandable than that. Try it, you might like it. But I do hope some of you will consider looking at After the Fire tonight when it's time to leave. When I'm on tour, people ask me, well, where do you get your ideas? And I find that question to be very annoying because it makes ideas sound like there's something that are sort of floating around in the air. And if you have a good enough butterfly net, you can drag down a couple of those and turn them into a book. It's a lot harder than that. What I've done in my writing career is I've taken little pieces of things I've learned along the way, and I've stitched them into the backgrounds of my books. I'm married to a man who's a retired engineer, a retired electronics engineer. He was actually part of the group that built that first brick-shaped, gray brick-looking cell phone that weighed 5.5 pounds. But he's retired now. I did a poetry reading of After the Fire at a widowed retreat on the 21st of June of 1985. And at that widowed retreat, I met a man whose first wife, Lynn, had died a few minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve, 1984-85. 2 years to the day after my first husband died. Bill and I struck up a conversation based on that coincidence. 6 months later, on the 21st of December, we got married. We were in love, our kids were not in love, so that was complicated. But So on the 21st of December, we will be celebrating our 29th wedding anniversary. So After the Fire is a very important book for me. But as I said, he's a retired engineer. And what engineers do is they fix things. We had been married a couple of years. We were still living in South Bellevue. And we were coming home from Seattle on I-90. It was when I-90 still had that little bubble in it for some strange reason. And so there was a lot of traffic on I-90. They've added more lanes. There's still a lot of traffic on I-90. But as we were driving across, I told Bill the problem I was having with the current book. I was working on Beaumont number 6. Excuse me, A More Perfect Union, Beaumont number 6. And Phil Kramer, Beau's nemesis, had just turned up at Seattle PD. And I wanted to create a character, a witness to a crime that Phil Kramer would just disregard. And Beau, being the kind of guy he was, would manage to get useful information out of this witness. And I asked Bill if he had any ideas, and so he thought about it for a minute, and then he said, you know, a few years ago, Bill and Tom, his sons, and I were in Fred Meyer. We were standing in line at the checkout counter, and behind us in line was a man who was clearly developmentally disabled, but he was buying a lunchbox. And he struck up a conversation with Bill because Bill is a nice guy and people talk to him. And this guy said that he was buying this lunchbox with his own money he earned from going to work at a sheltered workshop. And he got, the sheltered workshop was in Seattle, and he went from Bellevue to Seattle every day on the bus, and he had notes that he could give to the bus drivers so they made sure he got on the right buses. Boy, that story really struck a place in my heart. And later on, I asked Bill J., and I asked Tom about it, and both of them remembered that incident vividly. So while I was writing that book, I tracked down the sheltered workshop. It was established on some land, some federal property that was surplused in Shell Shoal Bay after the end of World War II. And I went down there. I interviewed some of the instructors. I interviewed some of the clients. And then I went home and I wrote the book. And I created a character named Jimmy Rising. Jimmy Rising witnesses the crime in A More Perfect Union. And here's something about my books. I do not outline my books. My husband, the retired engineer, would like it better if I outline my books. I met outlining in Mrs. Watkins' 6th grade geography class. I did not like outlining then. Nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind about outlining. In addition, I have a terminal fear of Roman numerals. And no Roman numerals, no outline, right? So I usually start with somebody dead, and then I write the book to find out who did it and how come. So I write for the same reason people read, to find out what happened. So I'm writing along in a more perfect union. And guess what? The bad guys figured out he was a witness. And they tried to rub him out. Lunch pail and all. They said they tried to murder him by dousing him, catching him on fire. And he died. But he's first taken to the burn unit at Harborview. And Bo goes there to visit him. Bo had come across Jimmy Rising sitting on the porch of his home, clutching his lunch pail and devastated because he had missed the bus and wouldn't be able to get to work. And so Bo drove him from Bellevue to the sheltered workshop. So Bo goes to the hospital to visit him. And he's down in the lobby, standing in front of the flower shop window, trying to figure out what flowers he should take up to Jimmy Rising's room. And then he realizes Jimmy Rising doesn't need flowers. What he needs is a new lunchbox. And so he goes to a hardware store and gets a lunchbox instead of flowers. See where that idea came from? A couple years later, the sheltered workshop held a big anniversary celebration, and Bill and I were invited along with the mayor and other dignitaries from Seattle. And I was very nervous about going because Jimmy Rising died. You know, they told me the story, they trusted me with their story, and yet when I put that character in my book, he didn't make it to the end of the book. So we were there, and I was talking to a gentleman he was taller than I was, so he was probably 6'3" or 6'4", north of 80 years old, wearing a nicely tailored suit. And I was telling him how nervous I was about coming to this event because Jimmy Rising died. And he said, "Oh no, you don't understand. For us, that's a happy ending. Because what we're worried about is what will happen to our children once we're gone." At that point in the conversation, a woman who looked to be about 50 years old came dancing up to him, clutching herself like a toddler would because she needed to go to the bathroom. It was his daughter, and he excused himself to go help her. Years later, when I wrote the book where Joanna Brady is sent to collect Junior Dowdle, who has been abandoned at an arts and crafts festival in St. David, a developmentally disabled man who's been just cut loose. She puts him in her patrol car, and he says, "Go, go, go." And she thinks he wants her to step on the gas and leave. Actually, he was referring to a different kind of going, which was very hard on her patrol car, by the way. But that grew out of that one conversation with that gentleman at the sheltered workshop. I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona, but in the Warren neighborhood of Bisbee. And the business area was 2 blocks of businesses. And when I was growing up, there was a developmentally disabled man named, I believe his name is Charlie. I could be wrong about that. But He spent his days riding his bicycle back and forth on those 2 blocks. He always wore pressed khaki clothing, pressed shirt, pressed trousers. He always had a deputy sheriff's badge pinned to his chest. And I never knew if it was a real deputy sheriff's badge that maybe belonged to a father or an uncle, or if maybe it was a toy deputy sheriff's badge, because the pistol he wore was sort of the Roy Rogers variety. So he was there when I was little, and he would have conversations with people you couldn't see, and but he wasn't a threat. And then by the time I was in high school, he changed, and he became angry, and he was shouting at people, and then he just disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. I don't remember there being a funeral service. I don't know anything about that. And I wish now that I had, in some way, reached out to his mother. And I do know now that people with mental deficits are more susceptible to things like Alzheimer's and dementia at an earlier age than the general population. And so I think writing Remains of Innocence, the way I have written that book, is a way of making a restitution for not having reached out to Charlie's mother back then. I spent 10 years selling insurance. When I transferred from Phoenix to Seattle, I met a guy in the office. His name was Arthur B. Cook. And Art Cook and I hung out. We'd go down and have coffee in the coffee shop downstairs. Sometimes we'd walk 2 blocks up the street to the doghouse and have lunch. And Art was a good guy, and we were friends. And then the first Beaumont book came out, and Art's wife, Muriel, went ballistic because Arthur B. Cook's middle name was Beaumont. And Muriel thought there was something going on. Well, there wasn't anything going on. But a couple of years later, when I had to choose between writing and selling life insurance, there was really no contest. And so I turned over my book of business to Art. And then about 10 years later, suddenly, this girl who had come into Seattle with nothing needed to have some estate planning done. And so when the advisor said we needed to have whole life insurance in a certain amount, I called Art Cook and had him write up the application. Art sold life insurance for more than 30 years. And that was the biggest whole life policy application he ever took. I gave him I signed the application, I took the physical, the policy was issued. But before he could deliver it, Art suffered a heart attack and died. By the way, Muriel did receive the commissions for that. But we went to Art's funeral. His funeral was at his church down in Auburn, where he had taught Sunday school for decades. And so at his funeral, there was no Beethoven's Fifth da-da-da-da type music. All the music they played at that funeral were Sunday school songs. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Jesus loves me, this I know. That's all I'm going to tell you about that. But you remember it when you're reading this book. I need to add one more thing about Phoenix. I came to Seattle. I started writing my books. I met Bill. And we got married in 1985. In 1986, we went back to Arizona for my folks' 50th wedding anniversary party. I took Bill to the office in Phoenix, where I had worked for all those years. And you know what? Those guys who never invited me out for a beer didn't recognize me because they had never seen me smile and they had never heard me laugh. And when I fly into Seattle and I see those skyscrapers, my heart is full of thanksgiving and gratitude because Seattle gave me my new life and they gave me back my smile and my laughter. And it's because of that that tomorrow at noon, I'll be flying back to Everett on my private jet. It's a jet card. I don't actually own it. I just have to show them my card. But to address the fundraising luncheon for the Snohomish domestic violence group, because I was never beaten up by my husband. But if you live with a drunk for 18 years, you've been through some hard times. And I understand how hard it is to walk away from a bad situation, even though walking away is what you really need to do. When I was trying I got a divorce. I had made arrangements to transfer my job to Seattle. Listed my house for sale, but nothing was happening, and I was in this terrible limbo. And the only place I could sleep was in church. I know I'd go to church, and I'd make it through the opening hymn, and the announcements, and the offertory, and the children's sermon, and the choir anthem. And as soon as the sermon started, I was out of there. I know Reverend McKinley noticed, because one day the title of the sermon was called On Sleeping in Church. I didn't hear it. So after church, when it was time to file out and shake hands, I said to him, "Mac, I am so sorry." He said, "Judy, obviously you're getting exactly what you need from church. Don't worry about it." So a couple weeks later, I was at church. It was time for the children's sermon. He called the kids to come up, told them to sit down and hold out their hand. So they did. And he reached in the pocket of his robe and he pulled out a roll of $1 bills. And he gave each of those kids a single dollar. And then he put those away and he reached into his other pocket and he pulled out a 10. And he held it out and he said to the kids, You can have this if you want it. But the only way they could take the 10 was to open their hands and let go of the 1. And not a single one did. And I felt like somebody had just run a charge of electricity through my body, because I realized that I hadn't opened my hand and my heart and let go of Phoenix. I went home that afternoon. I called the newspaper. I placed a want ad. I gave away my 2 dogs and my cat. I could not bring them to downtown Seattle. My house sold. I moved to Seattle. I started my new life. And I know that the people who run that domestic violence shelter in Everett have to help people open their hands and let go of what's bad for them in order to find what's good. How many people in this room have read my most recent Beaumont book, Second Watch? Okay. Some of you are missing out on something. It is my best book. It's the best book I've ever written. It is fiction. It's Beaumont. Starts with Beaumont having dual knee replacement surgery, just like my husband did. See, write what you know. And I found out about that when Bill did it. I don't have to do everything to write about it, but I do have to understand it. So it's Beau as we know him now, but it's also Beau as he was before I met him in the first book. And in Second Watch, you will meet a guy from Bisbee, Arizona, a guy who was a year ahead of me in school, who was valedictorian of the Bisbee High School class of 1961, who went from Bisbee to West Point to Vietnam, where weeks before his 23rd birthday, Doug Davis died in the Pleiku Highlands. In the book, I have taken my fictional character and had Doug be his commanding officer for only a matter of a couple of days, but enough for Doug to save Beau's life, not through an act of heroism, but through an act of kindness. And when Beau comes home, he makes no effort to reach out to the girl Doug was engaged to because he was guilty. Doug died, and J.P. Beaumont lived. Having the opportunity to tell Doug and Bonnie's real story with fiction as in the background is one of the greatest honors of my life. And the response to that book from people who said they too failed to reach out to the loved ones of their lost buddies have really been affecting the people who the women who have written to me and said, I'm another Bonnie Abney. Those stories are so amazingly moving, and it's been very difficult to go on and write about other books because that book, Second Watch, has had such a huge hold on my heart. In Tuscany, I sent the next Allie Reynolds book in, Allie Reynolds number 10. There will be, it's called Cold Betrayal. They made the cover before I ever finished writing the book. That's a little scary. There was supposed to be a novella, a Joanna Brady novella called The Old Blue Line that was supposed to be here tonight. There's been a huge problem with The Old Blue Line. You can get it as an ebook online, but they've had a devil of a time getting the Dead Tree copies out. So the orders are finally filtering out, but of course, it's too late for me to sign them. But here's the thing about me. If you get one of those later when I'm not in town, feel free to bring it and have me sign it the next time you see me, because my corporate policy is to leave no book unsigned. If you show up tonight with, I see that bag of books. Here's the thing, I will sign them all. But if you have more than 1 or 2 books, please plan on waiting until the end of the line, and then I will be happy to sign them. And so, given all that, I would like to say, I'm so glad we had this time together. Good night. I'll make my way out so I can be out there signing books, but thank you. This has really been fun.